feeling like a shark in a shrimp tank. Big fish, small pond in the shrimp tank. Hey
everyone, this is Mark Scribner, your host, with my co-host John Warner, who's right below here today. We have an amazing guest today. His name is David Chang. We're going to bring him on in just a minute. The tagline of this particular show, as you know, is where book smarts and street smarts collide. David's going to talk a lot about some of what maybe we'll label them as academic delinquents, but don't have the street smarts. I would like to remind all our listeners that you can find this show on the shrimptankpodcast.com/Boston. Also, the Shrimp Tank has 13 cities in and across the country, some of the most amazing entrepreneurs learning about some really cool concepts. We are nationally syndicated through iHeart, Google, Stitch, SoundCloud. Basically, anywhere you can get your podcast is where you could follow us. We'd love to get your followership. So with that said, just a real quick moment. John, can you tell us a little bit about Link and what Link does with data and how they're able to find really cool companies and bring them to a very, very high success rate?
Sure. Link Ventures, we love to scale companies. We're in the direct-to-consumer space. We have expertise with data to help companies find customers, save time, save years in scaling. And we want to build great companies, and we're really proud to be based in Boston. And we think our best is ahead of us, and we're looking to invest in another 12 companies for this fund. And I love doing this show with you because we meet some of the best and brightest who are going to be the people kind of defining the future. And Link Ventures is definitely a firm that can help them.
100%. What's really cool, and just a little props for David. He's been involved in some really storied names over his career. So the likes of PayPal, really just amazing companies. His space that he travels in is in what we call the angel space for our listeners. And it's a little different than private equity, but what he's able to do is focus on the early stage type of investing, trying to find the talent, the people that are out there, and almost shepherd them through the whole process, whether that be an exit or some type of an evolution as that goes. And we always give our guests a very, very hard time when they're on the show, when they have that Harvard MBA, and he actually happens to have that with the Goldman Sachs stint, and very, very accomplished. He looks a little bit too young to have a resume like that. But David, with that said, thanks very much for getting on our show, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Great to be here. And I have no accent, so that's a good thing, right? I'm actually from Long Island, used to have a pretty thick New York accent, did not pick up anything in Boston, did not. So I'm all good.
Great. So good. I just wanted to say, I did just in the pre-work for interviews and watching some of the stuff that you've been able to do. You do talk a lot about, just for our listeners, we can get right into the meat of what we want to talk about. But you often talk about three tenets, three principles that are very important as an angel investor for you. It's the people, it's the problem solving, and then is, in essence, the solution big enough for you to be wanting to take a look at a particular company? It's people, solutions, and I guess potential, maybe, if that's right. Is that fair to say?
I think it's very much like what everyone else looks for in the early days. And John, this is your world as well, that you're looking for something that's different. You're looking for something that has an opportunity. It almost always starts with people, because the idea typically changes and you go through pivots. And so the first requirement is just a team, and it could be a first-time founder with a ton of potential, or it could be a multiple-time founder with a ton of exits behind his or her back. And so it does start with the people side of things.
So,
go ahead, John.
Sorry, keep going, Mark.
Yeah, I was going to say, so you get, I don't even know how many pitch decks that you get all the time. And it seems that there's a lot of similarities and ideas based on what's going on in the world. Do you find that when you're getting pitch decks, are they all kind of the same type of a concept and there's just no originality or no vertical market when you're seeing a pitch deck?
It's a crazy variety. I'd actually I've seen the opposite, which is when you work with founders of all kinds. And I think that's actually a tagline from Babson. So I may have actually just stolen that from a wall that I've seen, but I'll happily cite them there. But they recruit for entrepreneurs of all kinds. You end up getting these pitch decks that are very, very different. So Sometimes the founder does a fantastic job of telling a story and it's an arc and you can't wait to actually meet the person because they've told this backdrop and they paint this big future. Other times it's a very, I wouldn't say rigid, but like it's a very structured deck where they walk through, oh, it's very clear that they went through school for this, right? They got the problem, they got the market size, they got the solution. And then other times you've got some founders that have never really put together anything. And so it's a really kind of light story and you have to like really dig hard to pull the nuggets out of it. And then and in other places, you've got founders that have done it a million times where it's like, wow, this thing is like super polished and they answered every question. And so there is a tremendous variety. And every time I see a deck, I wish there was a little bit more consistency because it would help as an investor to figure out, very quickly pull out the nuggets, but it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I absolutely love David. You're like the guardian angel for founders and startups in Boston. We're really lucky to have you. I think you're Yoda reincarnated, but you decided instead of training Luke Skywalker to train young startups. And you've had at least 6 startup exits yourself. You worked at TripAdvisor, PayPal, eDocs. You were at Goldman Sachs for 7 years before that. You came here as a 3-year-old from Taiwan. Your folks were accountants and ran a Chinese restaurant, and you went to Cornell Computer Science, and you applied to Harvard Business School 3 times, and they finally got smart and accepted you on one of them. I'm just curious, what do you think is Boston these days? There's a chip on Boston. People think, all the people left and went to Silicon Valley. We used to be the Silicon Valley. Where do we stand these days? I mean, Detroit used to be the Silicon Valley, before Silicon Valley. And what are we uniquely qualified to do really well? And I feel like part of the reason we're doing it well is because you're just in the trenches as a kind of advisor to startups to help them around operations.
One of thousands, but yeah,
not screwed up. But I feel like your example is an inspiration to many, and you're really important. But I'm curious, just step back, like where is Boston these days in terms of startups, and how are we going to do in the future, and where do we need to get better? What are we doing really well? Just take this in a bunch of different directions.
Yeah, well, firstly, the CIA dossier that you just pulled from my background was a little freaky. I think the majority of people that I know don't know all those details. And so kudos for digging through that. I guess this is very consistent with the Link Ventures strength of digging through data. So you got to give your data science folks a little hat tip for that. But on Boston, there are definitely fields where there's a strength. And when I think about any given region, much like Mark, when you'd open the podcast about 3 key things you look for in a founder, I think there are 3 key things that make a region strong. And one of them is the pure talent itself, right? And so probably don't need to share too much about how strong of a region this is, right? Whether it's the early stage founders, veterans that have done stuff, the students that are in the ecosystem. So you got a ton of smart people, lots of good stuff that's happening. The second one is around the gas that enables them to run their vehicles, right? And so it's generally around capital. It might be around some other scarce resource, right? It might be a customer base. There are absolutely people at companies that can help jumpstart these ventures. And so that supportive ecosystem, whether it's a customer, a partner, a vendor, you name it, that's also in abundance here. And then lastly, I think the part there that I've been super excited about, and maybe the place that I play the most, is just the glue that connects a lot of that. And so those are the accelerators, the mentors, the events. Like this morning, I was just at a 2-hour event for Unpitch. And so those are the things that kind of pull all that together. And so when you have a region with those 3, special things can happen. So that describes a lot of different cities. I think in Boston, there are these clusters where there's a tremendous amount of strength, right? Life sciences is clearly one. I'm not in that space, but that obviously is a massive one. You've got stuff like robotics, right? Clearly there's something that's happening there, and there's that flywheel that's happening. In my world, part of the reason why I'm so excited about what's happening in Boston is that I have a personal passion towards doing stuff that is maybe now a little bit more socially impactful. And I can't think of 2 places other than healthcare and education that we can make a dent on the universe. And so, we're on the planet for a limited period of time. And so if you can make healthcare better, whether it's through digital health or life sciences, or make education and learning better, those are both of those things that I'm super fired up to work on. And so when I think about like Boston in particular, those are two areas where we have some decent muscle. It's not the size of some other ecosystems, clearly, right? The Valley is just scale is just much bigger, but there's some really special stuff here, right? Whether it's the people or the companies or the investors behind it. And so I'm very bullish of what's happening here.
Can you take, I know the variety of the pitch decks that you get is very big, but let's just say I sent you a pitch deck and, I check some of the boxes off, you like me, you think I'm capable. Like, could you walk through like a timeline of how that would work working with someone like yourself?
Yeah. So on the earlier,
Pixelated. David, you hung up, unfortunately. Okay, sorry about that. Go ahead.
Got it. Do you want to re-ask the question or should jump straight in?
Yeah. I'm gonna. So, David, what you like me. I check off the boxes. I've got something that's kind of piqued your interest in terms of a solution and an opportunity. Where does that process, that arc go? Whether it be early stage or more developed, like how would that work working with you?
Yeah, I get that question a lot from founders. And so typically founders, when they are fundraising, the first couple checks come from friends and family. And it's not really friends and family. It's basically someone that knows that person, right? And so you may have babysat for the potential investor, or you may have worked as an intern for someone. It kind of almost doesn't matter, but the first couple checks in these concentric circles they're investing in the person, right? So it goes back to the team. Where I typically get involved.
You, but are they already have some kind of a funding? They get a runway. They're not completely just a paper napkin type of thing, but they do have some funding in place already. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm describing is like the typical arc in terms of like fundraising. And so the very first ring, if let's start from zero, you just have an idea that the first couple dollars may come from a friend or family, or it could come from like you actually, you're generating revenue. And so it's a bootstrap business, but that's like that first ring. And so that's a limited network of people. And so where angels typically get involved, and I'll put myself in that category, or you may have raised a little bit of friends and family. And just to be concrete, maybe it's $50,000, right? You've got something, maybe it's a little prototype, maybe it's no tech, but you've got people willing to pay for something. And so this next phase where you're going out and reaching out to folks as an entrepreneur, now you have to convince that not only do I believe in the idea, but I also believe in the person. And so it's just two things you have to convince. And so that's that next ring of folks. And so most of the founders that I see that are not in my network have to go through that kind of process. And there's so many dynamics around like psychology of investors and FOMO. And there's ways to set things up so that you can maximize how you reach out to investors. But that second piece is generally where angel groups get involved. And then I guess I put myself squarely in that space.
Mm-hmm. Hey, David, tell some quick stories. Stark Tank, Mobilicious, DraftKings, and Crashalytics.
That actually sounds like this random bag of like, connect the dots for all of these different things. And so I'll try to remember each one of them. So Stark Tank was something that we created as PayPal. And maybe the interesting thing there was that after we got acquired by PayPal in 2011, we upscaled our office from a 100+ person office to 65,000 square feet, which I think holds like 350 people, right? And so it's a massive jump up. I think the build out was like $20 million. So it was some outlandish number. So we had all this extra space, and many of us being founders and entrepreneurs ourselves wanted to just keep our hands in that. And so we created this innovation space called Stark Tank, kind of, play off of Shark Tank. And it was just a place where founders could camp and spend some time with us. And we didn't have a very specific mandate. It was just something that we created because we wanted to create it. And there was a potential benefit to PayPal because there was you could find like the next big company that would use PayPal in the space. And it also was just great in terms of just a space where people could meet each other. This was before the WeWorks and the CICs really kind of took off. And so that was that experience for StartTank. On Mobitious, which was a venture capital failure from my standpoint, we were trying to create a service that enabled people to discover content to their phones. And this is just before like user-generated content really kind of took off. And so we ended up raising something like $6.5 million of venture capital, pivoted the business to mobile photo sharing. And the mobile photo sharing startup called Snap My Life eventually did sell, but it was like a pennies on the dollar kind of thing. This was just before Instagram kind of took off. And so that timing was clearly off. And we made so many mistakes as part of that. And I'm happy to share more about all the wrong things I did there. And then, and I think the other two that you just mentioned, Crashlytics was an early, was an early angel investment. And that was one of the cases where, yeah, and a handful of other Boston-based folks, right? And I had met the founders through I think Techstars originally. We may have both been like fellow mentors, and we were both in the North End at some point, and we caught up over some oysters at Neptune Oyster, and ended up investing in that in the two founders, Wayne Chang and Jeff Seibert, and they've gone on to do some phenomenal stuff. And so that was probably, I think that was maybe my second angel investment, and so definitely a right place, right time. Had a little bit of insight in what they were developing because we were also in that space, and that basically kind of helped fuel the angel investments for the next couple of years, right? Because that was just a great win for everyone involved.
David, what do you think? It's probably a loaded question, but from an angel perspective, what's considered like a good batting average? I mean, if you're getting 10 deals, I mean, are you batting 300, or what do you kind of see in your universe in terms of a reasonable batting average?
Yeah, I think that I would put it in the same scale as like how venture firms measure returns, right? Like the IRR of, I don't know, was it like 2 to 3x or 200 to 300% over the period of time that, but I'm finding that most angel investors, because they don't do it professionally, do it for so many different reasons, right? Like on one end of the spectrum, you've got folks like a Gene Hammond or Joe Caruso, two local angel investors that take it very seriously, right? Very methodical. They do it, and they don't operate all that differently from a venture firm, but it's just their own money, right? And so that's one end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum, we've got folks that just are philanthropic, right? They've made a bunch of money, but they want to put their money in certain places. And most of the people I know are not at those two extremes. And so most of the angels I know are, and I'm in this category, where we're typically involved because we want to either get deeper in an industry, or we have some sort of expertise that a founder could leverage. And so there's just like other factors that come into play. And so it's hard to calculate the overall kind of return, because like the financial piece isn't always the main driver.
Could I just, John, I'm sorry, just to get a good follow-up on that. So, it sounds to me that it's so critical, like if you're to marry the right angel investor with the right expertise, and oftentimes, we see pitch decks and it could be like a pharmaceutical thing, but they're pitching it to, someone who's a data scientist. Like, do you find that there's a lot of like just waste of time that people don't understand, what audience or expertise they're talking with?
So Mark, that's a fantastic point. There's so much wasted time, and it's something I've thought very deeply about, and I'm happy to share. But I think there's essentially like 6 filters that you have to run through the gauntlet, and at the end of that, you'll find like your ideal investor. Space is one, location is another one, stage is one, the industry, the thesis, and the social filter. Can't actually believe I remembered all 6 of those, but I don't keep me in check if that actually was 6. But as you go through each one of those, like what you mentioned about industry is a major one, right? Like if that's not my focus, or if I don't know anything about it, then I can't really weigh in on it. If I write $25,000 checks and you're looking for $1 million investments, there's a mismatch. And the flip is also true. Location's a big factor in the early days. What I believe in also, in terms of our thesis is also really different. And so like, if you're a founder looking for an investor, make sure you filter it very appropriately. Like I think in the early days, we had the CTO of Pandora share with us how many people they talked to before they got their first round of funding. And I think he'd said 360. So he got 360 no's before the 361st one of a yes, right? Save yourself the time. Don't do that.
It's a Walt Disney story. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, a good friend of mine was the chief curator of music for Pandora, and another friend was one of the early investors. And he has 16 acres in Mill Valley looking at the Golden Gate Bridge. He did pretty well from that one. Hey, David, Mark and I love technology. Like, we geek out on technology. I got a report on CES a few days ago and sent it to Mark, and we were trading notes. Tell us about what do you think are some of the cool tech things on the horizon that some of the next wave of startups are going to really leverage? I mean, it took the mobile phone, it took the internet, it took a bunch of different things to create a lot of the successful startups of our startups of the future, to be watching.
I could answer that. But I will be fully transparent on this one. It is just a complete finger in the air, right? Like I have learned.
Bill Gates wrote a book about the future and didn't mention the word internet. So don't worry if you get it wrong. I just think you're in a good place to throw a few things out there, and
we'll get you back if you're right.
No, it's but I wanted to toss that out there because I actually get that question a lot, right? Like I especially from first-time founders. I know you're much more savvy than the first-time founder, but they ask, like, I've got an idea in a space. What do you think of the space? And I'm like, you know the space better than I do. Like my opinion on it is worthless, right? It's worth less than one data point. And so, when I am forced to think through, like, what are the trends that are happening, I can always bet that I'm going to be wrong. And so the things that I find personally interesting are places where, and this is maybe goes back to your technology statement, that there are places where in a year's time, something can be 10 times better, not 10% better. And I know it's kind of trite just to say that because it's not, being very specific, but it really had occurred to me, it was maybe about 6 months ago, when someone had asked, I'm like, oh, why don't you get involved in this nonprofit? It's got all the great things you just, mentioned. It's helping people. It's got, it has to do with entrepreneurship, be working with students, you'd be teaching. And I couldn't put my finger on, like, why it wasn't appealing. It was because even if I knocked that out of the park and did an absolutely fabulous job of it, that the next year, the most it could get better would be 10%, right? And maybe, recruit someone a little bit different. We change the process a little bit. Maybe the cohort size would be like 35 instead of 30. And so I realized that, going back to my kind of own software upbringings, is that the power of tech is if you can do things in such a way that are different enough that the output is so disproportionate from the input. And so I think things that have network effects are pretty massive. Obviously, the whole pandemic has kind of thrown things in a little bit of a different loop, but you see some companies that have just completely skyrocketed. And so, if I were to try to pick an industry and maybe kind of isolate it to Boston, it would have to be around places where we had some sort of head start, and which is why I'm gravitating back towards things in education. Even though the sales cycles are really long, I think if you hit some sort of tipping point, things can go really right pretty quickly. And so I'm looking for those kinds of nuggets as opposed to trying to bet on an overall, trend, whether it's, blockchain or something else that's happening within the industry. Because I find that, like, there's too much buzz that's out there and people just chase buzz.
Yeah, definitely. We had mentioned offline, oftentimes a lot of the founders, they can come from more or less an academic background. They're very rigid in their thinking, but in some cases, the tagline is where book smarts and street smarts collide. Do you find that whether it be, business school, when you're getting pitch decks, that they have that all buttoned up, but they don't have the street smarts or the kind of the work experience to navigate? They might be very much like a data engineer, but in terms of, like, the street smarts, it just is lacking.
Yeah, a little bit. And I think Mark caught a little bit of a Boston accent there. I heard, yeah. It just slipped right out. So I just had to call you on that one. But I do I do see quite often those early founders that are a little bit more kind of by the book in terms of just, I downloaded a template of a pitch deck. I'm going to fill in the gaps. They think the idea is worth the whole thing, right? As anyone that's been in the industry for a while, the idea is worthless, right? That insight's kind of worthless. And so I think my main task is trying to figure out ways to jumpstart that idea as quickly as possible to the next stage. So how can you de-risk it? How can you figure out where there's really demand and where there's no demand? And so it's bringing it to the streets, in your analogy of book smart meets street smart. And so some of those lessons are the ones that just came over time. As a little bit of an aside, as an example, my first job coming out of business school was at a big software company, but it was enterprise. So we'd push out software every year. I started TripAdvisor. First thing, the CEO says, all right, great. It's like a Monday, we're going to push live this Thursday. And my thought was, oh my God, what are the chances I join the 1 week we push live, And he's like, no, we do this every week. And it was such like a mind shift for me that I couldn't understand. And that's a lot of what we're trying to teach the student founders that are coming out of school, right? Like, reduce the cycles, reduce that iteration cycle, because the more you shorten that, the more of a likelihood you will to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, David. So I took Clay Christensen's class at Harvard Business School. His daughter sat next to me the whole class, and it was a great experience. And Anne would whisper in my ear, "That's not exactly how I remember it." But Clay, his last class was about work-life balance, and just how to invest in your marriage and your priorities. I know, in this pandemic, I think there's a lot of new normals and people evaluating what they prioritize. I know you and your wife, have collaborated on some things. You're in a similar space. Just maybe some advice to new entrepreneurs. What have you learned through your journey? What are some best practices? What are some mistakes? I think people might find that interesting, given the space you and your wife are in.
Yeah, and maybe the biggest thing for me was the work-life balance can happen at certain times. I got pretty lucky in that the past couple of ventures that I've been a part of were with people that also got that, right? And the startup that we sold to PayPal, a number of us were roughly the same age. We knew that if our kids needed to have something done and we needed to be somewhere, that would be it, and we just go ahead and do that. And so you didn't get this pushback from the rest of the group about, oh, well, why is that person leaving? And so you catch up at night and you do your email at night and all that. And so I think maybe one is to figure out, based on where you are in your life, just make sure whatever organization you're part of, whether you choose to found your own company or if you're joining another company, that they also just have similar values. And it's not to say one is wrong and one is right, but it just has to be a match. We have a pretty good friend, Shreen and I have a pretty good friend who, his name's Noam Bardeen. He is the former, at this point, CEO of Waze. And so he pushed out a blog post, I think it was 2 days ago, about how a number of things about just, big corporations and technology. And then he mentions work-life balance as part of that. And a bit of the thing that's kind of out of whack is that right now, the current generation of new folks in tech, they've just seen a lot of good stuff. And so their expectations for balance is just kind of out of whack from where it was many years ago. And so it's not to say you can't do those things, but you just got to find like a company that actually has the same sort of vibe as where you are. And so there are certain times where you're just going to hunker down and just, spend 24/7, doing work. And there are other times that you're not. And so just make sure you're picking appropriately.
Yeah, we're about to wrap up into the segment, but I do have one more question for you, if that's okay. I think one of the many great things about you, from speaking with you just real briefly today and before the show started, is that you're very much a pay it forward type of person. I know that you are in the process of starting kind of a community, if you will, to kind of educate people, to have another place to go where entrepreneurs can learn, but also connect with like-minded people like yourself. Could you possibly speak a little bit about that?
Sure. I guess the shortest version of that is for many years been trying to figure out how to bridge some of these gaps. And so both John and Mark, you are also in the business of trying to connect people. And so I do think that there's a much better way for founders and investors and mentors and advisors to connect. I don't know what that exactly is, but the beginnings of reducing some of that friction are coming from some of the efforts that I've been involved with. And so along with a handful of other angels, we launched a club last year. It was almost about exactly a year ago this time, called TBD Angels, of mainly operators and entrepreneur type angels. And so it was no more than just, hey, let's trade some ideas because we've got some, we're seeing some interesting things, and that just exploded. And so from that group of, a half a dozen, we're now 140 angels kind of across the country. And so it's just great to see kind of people kind of coming together at that level. And so it's, I think that's the beginning of something that could be potentially pretty big, but overall where this all fits is just reducing the amount of friction between founders and investors, that if you can find a better way to find the right person to help fund your business and the right person to join your business, that's where the real network effects come into play. And so I'll be digging in further on that in the coming years.
That's a one. John has one more question. Yeah.
Yep. Thanks. David, my last question is, you and I both are interested in the direct-to-consumer space. What do you think the future of that is, and what's unique about Boston? We're definitely known for life sciences and robots. I think if 100 years from now, people could look back and say, look at all those great direct-to-consumer companies that were created. What do you think is the near term holds for that and medium term?
Yeah, I may point that back to you as to what your investment thesis is, but from my standpoint, I do think there's a pretty wide range, right? There's pure direct to consumer and there's pure B2B. I think most of the models these days, it's a mix of all of them, right? Whether it's like B2B to C or it's using another organization to grow. I do think that from a direct to consumer standpoint, with all the tech that's coming into play that's reducing the cost of bringing something directly to the consumer, there's just going to be so much more stuff that can be put in front of someone. And so I think if you can take a vertical approach where you narrow your target audience, and it's not so much vertical search, but if you narrow the problem that you're solving, and the more tight that you get that focus, the more likelihood that you as an entrepreneur will hit that target. And so I do think in cases when it comes to consumer internet, starting with that really tight wedge, serving that problem really well, taking some of the strengths in Boston, whether it is life sciences, robotics, education, and whatever that is, if you can get the first 1,000 of people to really love what you're doing, that's the start, right? And then you get the 10,000, the 100,000, and the million, and goes on and on. And so I do think that there's all these little seeds that are out there that if we could find a way to provide some more fuel to that, I think there's some great stuff that'll come out of that.
It's fascinating. Well, David, on behalf of John and myself, I'd love to have you back on, and we can maybe go back to some of your futuristic guesses. I think you're spot on with what you're doing, and I know you're highly regarded in the community for the work that you do, and fostering and mentoring and doing things like that. So we'd love to have you on again at some point. For our listeners, David, what's the best way to get a hold of you? Your information will be below your video at the end of the show, but is there any kind of best practices or places that you recommend to be connected with?
Yeah, probably the best way is just my website. It's just www.davidchang.me. So easiest to remember. And this is David Chang, not the chef. So I sometimes try to slide into restaurants using that name. But if you're looking for the chef, you'll be sorely disappointed when you go to davidchang.me. But if you're an entrepreneur and you're looking to connect, then that's a pretty good place.
That's great. Well,
and any entrepreneur, if you find a bottle and you can rub it and get 3 wishes, I would wish to get David Chang as a confidant, as an advisor, as a spiritual leader. You've just been amazing. And, part of having you on the show is Mark and I wanted to thank you for your leadership and your role modeling, and you're just kicking ass and taking names.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, David.
I've been feeling like a shark in a shrimp tank. Big fish, small pond in the shrimp